this video, we're going to be talking about getting surgical with EQ. What do I mean by getting surgical with EQ, and why is this something that's important to us at the mixdown stage? What I mean by getting surgical with EQ is really identifying problem areas in our sounds and dealing with them by using usually subtractive EQ. Subtractive meaning to pull down certain parts of the EQ, of the spectrum. The reason that you want to be doing this at the mixdown stage rather than the mastering stage is obviously if you have all of these different resonant spikes and you're throwing them into a finished track, the mastering engineer has very little choice if he or she wants to take those spikes down in the mastering stage. Obviously you'd then be taking down, elements of every other sound around that same frequency range. So it makes sense to get clinical, to get surgical at the mixdown stage and really get into the nuts and bolts of the sound that each particular part is offering the track. Now, this is where the very first tutorial in this series about the role and function of each part. And if you haven't seen that, I'd really strongly advise you go and have a look at it on my YouTube channel. That very first tutorial, we spoke about getting very clear on the role of each track. Now, this tambourine part that I've got up here as a demonstration is really a great case in point. Now, you would have thought with the tambourine part, there's really only one thing that it can do, and that's to be tambourine, right? Not true. So the tambourine could provide something that's quite aggressive and quite percussive, and if we listen to it, it's what it's doing already. If you pay attention to that kind of those high mids, there's quite a bit going on in there. There's quite a bit of like percussive energy. Now, by using surgical EQ, we can actually identify problem areas within this sound or resonant spikes and pull them down. I'm just going to turn all of these off for a second so you can completely see what I mean. So here's our waveform, and the reason I'm choosing this Pro Q3 from FabFilter is just because it has a really clean, neat interface, and you can just you can see exactly what's going on. I can't expand on that any further. I could make it whole screen, I suppose. So why don't we do that so you can see really clearly. So here you can see all of these like core spikes that are happening in the track. Now, a lot of these spikes are actually creating the percussive energy, like the hit of the tambourine as it's being hit against somebody's hand. But there are ways we can quite radically change the sound by simply finding where those hit points are and taking out some of that kind of those resonant spikes. In order to do that, we create a new EQ point, and you can do this on really any form of EQ where you can clearly see some form of spectrum analysis going on in the background, and critically a form of EQ where you can create an extremely narrow band like I'm doing here. So your Q setting would be a very, very high setting, which gives you a very, very narrow frequency range that you're going to be affecting. Now just watch your ears as I scroll up through the frequency spectrum whilst listening to this particular EQ. I'm going to add a whole bunch of gain, and we're going to start getting a fairly loud ringing sensation. So what you're listening for really is anything that absolutely jumps out of the mix to you. And as soon as we get there, you can see and hear something that's extremely harsh and piercing. So I'm going to turn that one off and just basically activate each of these resonant spikes that I've found by using that same technique. So you would just go through your sound, you'd find all of the resonant spikes, and then effectively take the gain down to a level that feels comfortable without sort of destroying the essence of the sound. So what I have at the top here as well is I actually have a high cut filter. These are all sort of peak resonant bell curve filters, and this one at the top is like a peak cut, because basically, or a high cut, because we had this very strong sort of peak here at 24 kilohertz, which is really beyond the realm of human hearing, and we kind of don't need that extra headroom being taken up in our track. So if we activate that, you can hear that the sound has changed quite radically. Now, in order to remind you of what it sounded like before, I'm just going to A/B between the two, and you'll see exactly what I mean. That's the original. And this is a very different sound. So this has a much sort of smoother feel to it. Now, if we add another instance of, in fact, I'll take that one off, and we'll just add another instance of the Pro Q3 here, and delete this one. And with this one, what we're going to do is just use a little bit of shaping EQ to show you that, and this is going to be on a very gentle band, but we can now bring out, without bringing too much of those resonant frequencies out, we can now bring out some of the kind of like high mids and bring some of that kind of aggressive hitting sound of the tambourine back into play. And that's the value really of surgical EQ, is that you're first and foremost, you're able to, by reducing those resonant peaks, you're minimizing the amount of headroom that the sound's taking up, but you're also able to quite substantially change the character of the sound itself. Now, using a similar technique on these percussion parts, you can hear that this is a very sort of resonant sound. If we look at the Pro Q3 again, you can hear and see that there are a couple of core frequencies here that the lower congas are providing. And then in this area here, you can hear some bongos. And the bongos are less resonant. And then obviously we have this shaker at the top end. So one of the questions you should be asking yourself at this point with your own track is, what is the role of this particular part? Did I bring this part in to create a resonant conga that was going to be providing a lot of momentum to the track? Or was it really the busyness of the bongos in the kind of upper mids that I was interested in? Or is that shaker the main reason why I brought the sample into play? Or am I happy with all three of those different components playing an equal role? And clearly, the decision that you make at that point of understanding what the function of this part should be is really going to inform the way that you EQ it and the way that you process it. For example, we could add these little resonant dips here using the same technique that we did on the tambourines and really change the quality of the sound. And by doing this, I'll exaggerate it even more. What you've actually done here is pretty much take those congas out of the sample altogether. So now we're really focusing just on this mid-range of the bongos, and then we have that kind of shaker at the top end. Now, getting surgical with EQ doesn't just involve using these very, very narrow, surgical EQ strikes. You can also, in this case, you can use a very steep curve on a high cut filter. You can see you can virtually eliminate just doing that. Make it a bit smoother by reducing the Q curve a little. So by doing that, we've completely changed this sound. We've taken out the congas almost entirely by ducking down the frequencies of that sound. We could also, to make sure that the bottom end is cleaned up, we could get surgical with that. And now we could apply it like a much wider curve, and this is something we'll be dealing in a later tutorial with, is the kind of shaping EQ. But we could shape this to really bring out those bongos in the mid-range. And if we A-B the sound, and the two sounds are virtually unrecognizable from one another. But again, it really comes down to the role that you want the part to be playing within the track, and also to a large extent the way in which the part is interacting with other parts within the track, particularly other parts of the same type. So for example, you know, your other percussion parts. So that's just to recap. I think, you know, surgical EQ can be used in a whole bunch of different ways. The goal of it is to identify problems, ideally with kind of resonant spikes or any frequencies that are just jumping out of the mix that you want to sit on and you just want to control a little bit. It can also be used as a means of really tailoring the sound to a specific role that you have in mind for it within your track. So this is a very, very powerful technique. It's something that isn't required necessarily on every sound, but it's well worth looking at when it comes to percussion sounds, especially because they do tend to have these little kind of resonant spikes that can, you know, have a compound effect over the course of layering various different sounds together, and it, you know, can make the track rather harsh in certain, you know, aspects of the frequency spectrum. Anyhow, I hope you've enjoyed today's video. I've really enjoyed putting this together for you, and if you have, then please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel, where you'll find a bunch of similar content. And also check out my website at mixingmasteringmentoring.com, where I offer a whole range of mixing, mastering and mentoring services, including one-to-one mentoring sessions. And you can also find a whole bunch of free PDF downloads on my site, as well as all of these tutorials in one place. Thanks for watching.